Thank you so much for the invitation to talk to your group today. I've been involved with the European Astrobiology Institute for a couple of years now, and it's fantastic to be able to present this work on moral habitability for human space exploration. And first, let me apologise for the fact I have to share this in the current visibility, because when I go full screen, for some reason, it's cutting off some of the text, so we'll have to leave it in the view that it's currently in. So I'm the head of the Ethical, Legal and Social Implications of Emerging Technologies Research Group, ELSIET, at the Iverson Health Innovation Research Institute at Swinburne University of Technology in Australia. So in Australia, before we start any presentations, we like to acknowledge the country on which the work was conducted. So for me, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation's traditional lands, where Swinburne's campuses are located. So we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and of course extend a particular welcome to any First Nations people that are joining us on this call. So hopefully the images are progressing as I'm going through them. Please let me know if you can't see them. So I know that this talk is going to be a little bit different to what you might get in astrobiology in general, because I'm looking at space ethics. And space ethics is one of those areas where we see a lot of different opinions coming up, lots of different views about what we should and should not do in space. And essentially, space ethics just takes on board all of those things that we think we should be doing in space-related endeavours, including ethical technology development and dealing with issues like commercialization and militarization, and what are the ethical issues there. But it also considers things like our ethical obligations to the space environment itself, to celestial objects, and to the potential for extraterrestrial life or biosignatures. So any form of life that we might find in space, we might have an ethical obligation to. So moving into moral habitability. So if you've come to one of my talks before, you might have seen some of the material that I'm going to cover, but I've made sure I've drawn from a couple of different case studies. So even if you be familiar with one of them, you won't be familiar with the others. So moral habitability was a term that was developed for emergency room nurses, and I am deeply indebted to Rebecca van der Heide for her work in this area. Now, if I look at the AI overview of this term, it actually gives us a really good summary. It says moral habitability refers to the quality of a social or organisational environment in terms of its capacity to support individuals' moral agency and values, and to foster ethical behaviour and decision-making. It's about whether a workplace, community or other setting allows people to act ethically and live according to their values, or if it creates conditions that hinder or compromise their moral integrity. And what we're concerned about there, of course, is if you feel like you can't behave in alignment with your moral views, you may suffer moral injury. So that's when you can't actually behave in the way that you think or you know is right because of the other constraints that you're facing. So if we look at how does history tell us what might happen when we start exploring space, and particularly the lessons that we learn from these places where moral injury typically occurs. So we know from emergency rooms, we know from war zones, we know from a variety of different settings that humans under stressful conditions often do terrible things, especially when there's limited oversight. So when humans discover new life and environments, they tend to enslave and destroy it. So we've seen that throughout history. Sometimes that's just because they're incompetent, they don't understand it, and sometimes it's malicious. So they do understand what they're doing and they're actually choosing to engage in that destructive behaviour. living according to our values is likely to be prohibitively difficult in space due to things like resource constraints and lack of agency and conflicting ethical duties. So space is hard. It's difficult for humans to interact with the space environment, but the more we're engaged with that, the more likely we are to come across a number of ethical dilemmas regarding resources and freedoms, things that might come into conflict when we have a mission in space that requires that everyone works together. So my first argument is that we are not ready to ethically choose who goes to space. So at the most basic, when it comes to human space exploration, I'm saying ethically, we actually don't know who we should be sending and how we should be making that decision. So a couple of projects that I've worked on, we can see the one called Reclaiming Space. For that one, I was asked to talk about a Noah's Ark scenario. So imagining that the Earth is headed for ecological apocalypse and we have to choose a certain number of people to go into space to try and set up a human colony. And then we have the social sciences of outer space, looking at how we could increase diversity in the space industry and potentially for human habitation off-world. So how do we value different types of humans when we decide who gets to go into space? So if we decide, and it's very common for people to think this, that in the case of an ecological apocalypse scenario where we're sending a small number of humans off-world to try and preserve the species, that we would only send able-bodied, physiologically fertile people who are willing to procreate to rebuild the species. But if we decide those are the only people we're going to send to our new space colony, many would argue that we're not really saving humanity at all. We're actually saving a very limited subset of people, and we've lost all the diversity that actually made us special. So the question becomes ethically, is diversity the kind of thing we can sacrifice in the face of extinction, or would sacrificing it be our extinction? And if we preferentially select physiologically fertile people, is this unlawful discrimination, or potentially is that a form of reproductive slavery for the people that we've selected? Because what happens if they change their mind? We've given them a seat on our Noah's Ark sort of lifeboat because we've decided they're good for the species. But what if they change their mind, or they in fact have difficulty procreating off-world? What sort of rights might they lose in that scenario? And then we have that concern about reproductive slavery and a loss of reproductive autonomy. So this is how that might play out if we want to preserve humanity, but preserving humanity involves procreation, and some forms of diversity limit reproductive potential. Some might argue we need to limit the diversity to promote procreation, so selecting for fertility, including social fertility. However, limiting diversity does not preserve humanity. So I would argue that what we would be saving would actually not be the human species. It would just be a very homogenous small group of human beings. So that would really limit the success of that kind of mission. But we might also say, okay, we've limited that diversity. We've said it's for the greater good, desperate times, desperate measures. But what we actually would find in that scenario would be the diversity reappearing in the next generation. So we would also find things like infertility occurring in the next generation. And because we've selected for particular traits to try and survive in space, it is likely that the people who are diverse, who might, for example, be socially infertile or physically infertile, are likely to suffer repression in that kind of regime. So this is a threat to human survival. Tyranny is always a threat to our long-term survival. So again, we would not be preserving humanity that way. So I ran this experiment with some university students, and I asked them, who would you save if you could only, for example, save 100 humans? What would be the ethical way to do that? And they started coming up with the typical arguments like We need able-bodied people on our mission. We need physiologically fertile people to have children. And then I started asking questions like, what about linguists, so that people can communicate and they can build things together even if they don't speak the same language? And eventually these poor students decided that we would not have any other languages. We would just have one central language, and we would only select people for our Noah's Ark that spoke the same language. I asked them about religious leaders and cultural leaders, and they initially said, yes, of course we need that. We need to support the spiritual needs of people on our new colony. And then eventually they decided, oh, but if we have different religions, they might fight with each other, and that would undermine the survival of the mission, and therefore we're not going to have any religions either. I asked about artists, and they were like, that would be great, but the artists also need to be engineers, otherwise they can't build things that we need. And of course, there are some artists who are wonderful engineers, but that's really limiting our selection there. And what about people with disabilities? So in the initial argument, they were all saying, oh, we want diversity, we want to respect the rights of everyone to have a chance to be saved in this scenario. But eventually they also concluded that we couldn't afford the diversity that might include people with different religious beliefs, different cultural beliefs, different languages, and people with different levels of ability. Now, given the fact that these students started class saying they really appreciated the diversity of the human species, that they were really respecting all the equal human rights of every person on the planet, being forced into a situation where they've essentially abandoned those values means that it was not morally habitable for them. They were very conflicted when they came to these very hard decisions that they thought perhaps were in the best interest of the species. Now, I would argue that it's in fact not in the best interest of the species to eliminate this diversity. Different languages carry unique messages, and those messages are important to sustain. Different religions can motivate different behaviours and care for other people. Art is incredibly important for our mental health. And people with disabilities not only bring diverse perspectives, but also if we're thinking about a space environment, we're thinking about perhaps a new habitation for humans, people are going to suffer disabling accidents, and the expertise of people with lived experience of adapting to that environment with differently abled bodies would be essential for survival. So again, preserving that diversity is a really important part of preserving the moral habitability, but also the effectiveness of that colony. And I am using the word colony deliberately there because we are thinking of a scenario where humans have already destroyed their own home and they're off potentially going to be taking advantage of another home. So the next point is we are not ready to ethically organise working conditions in space. So I was also asked to consult on this project, the human factor in the settlement of the moon. And essentially my part was looking at OH&S, considerations for off-world work. So ethics can be very fun, but we often get the OH&S and risk mitigation parts of a project as well, which tend to be slightly less fun. But then when they tell you that your OH&S argument is for the moon, it becomes more interesting again. So this is one of my favorite quotes, and I use it in almost all of my talks when I talk about space. And this is from University of Edinburgh astrophysicist Charles S. Cockle. He says, space is inherently tyranny prone. And this is from an interview. So space is an inherently tyranny-prone environment. You are living in an environment where the oxygen you breathe is being produced by a machine. On Earth, he notes governments can rob their people of food and water, but they can't take away your air. So you can run off into a forest and plan revolution, and you can get your friends together and you can try and overthrow a government. So you've got options as long as you can breathe, as long as you're on a planet that allows you to grow food, for example. So you can go off grid and you can try and defend your human rights, even if you're in a very oppressive environment. In space, you don't have that option. So it means that the powerful are likely to be very powerful. So the lessons we've learned from history, again, when regulatory bodies are far away, might is right tends to prevail. And workers have no power if they cannot safely withhold their labour. So if they want labour conditions that are safe, they have to be able to leverage something. And if they can't leave their employment because they lose access to the facility that's providing their air, then of course that's going to be a problem. We might also find, particularly with things like mining facilities on the moon, for example, that one country might have very different OH&S standards for their miners compared to another, but they're likely to be working in the same facility. So we might even end up with economic refugees going from one side of the facility to another because they're being exploited or the working conditions are not safe. So morally habitable off-world employment may actually depend on establishing a right to return clause in any off-world working contracts. So that was the sort of conclusion that I came to when working on that project. So the next point is we are not ready to ethically create law and order in space. And this was a fun one. I got to work with Nikki Coleman on this text, Military Space Ethics, where we tried to envisage a legal system for a colony on Mars. But the other image I have on the screen there is from a project that we ran with some primary school students. They were building with Lego cities for space, and we asked them, what do you need for your hypothetical city of human beings in space? So I went table to table with these elementary school students and asked them, what are you going to need first? What's the most important thing for you to build for your colony? And one table said the first thing that we need is a method of executing our prisoners. And I thought that was deeply disturbing. And they had come up with a very elaborate system where they were going to be dangling people through holes in the ice on their ice planet so that they could be eaten by piranhas. I tried to tell them that there were no piranhas in space, but that did not deter them. They were planning to bring the piranhas with them and put them in the ice planet so that they could execute their prisoners. And I found that deeply disturbing, but they did have arguments regarding why they thought it was very important to have incredibly strict law and order in space in order to make sure that there was no violence and that there was very heavy sort of penalties to disincentivize any antisocial behavior. But when we think about legal issues in space, we're also looking about things like ownership of resources and facilities. And if we're thinking about something like mining, which is going to be one of my case studies, we've got the issue of claim jumping and piracy. And this is something that I've been working on with Tony Milligan. So this is essentially when one company, instead of developing their own technology to mine an asteroid, for example, they might just get very good at surveilling someone else's company. And then they steal the data about the asteroid, about what it's made of, the composition, how it might be mined, where it is, etc. And then they just jump ahead and they get to that asteroid first, and they use all that information, all that scouting data in order to take the resources that others have actually researched and worked towards. Piracy being obviously less likely, but that would essentially just be theft of the resources after they've been mined, for example. So that could lead to conflicts. We're likely to have some territorial conflicts once we're out in space. One country might want to claim part of a planet. Another country might want the same area or the same part of a facility, for example. And our more broad questions might include things like, if we discover non-human intelligent life, should we grant it some form of human rights as we conceive of them? So what rights would they have? So again, if we look to history, due process might be treated as a luxury that the hostile space environment cannot afford. If we think of those poor students who abandoned their ideals of diversity at the first hurdle when they came across a life and death scenario. So if we think back to Starlink's terms for a Mars colony that were quite provocative and released to the media, claiming that any such colony would reject Earth law. We had international space lawyers saying that that doesn't hold, that it wouldn't be valid. But the reality is, again, if regulatory bodies are on Earth, it will be very difficult to enforce any of these rules. Hard labour, so something like a mining penal colony or capital punishment, could possibly be used to maintain order. And our legal rights are a lot more fragile than we think. If authorities can manufacture a sense of urgency, necessity, they can justify anything. So the struggle to survive in space will always be available as an excuse. So it's an extreme case that they can always draw on in order to justify extreme behaviours. And again, those primary school students are already there. They're already planning very violent capital punishment to maintain order on their colony. So next, we are not ready to ethically share space with other life. So the question of whether we should mine off-world, whether we should attempt to terraform, should we develop that technology, whether we think celestial bodies actually have any rights themselves not to be disturbed, and whether human survival needs trump potential alien life. So do we think that our survival is always going to be more important than another species? Or do we think preserving life in space is incredibly valuable? And I love the image that we have there because, of course, people are destroying species on Earth every day, but we seem to be very concerned about even potentially destroying bacteria that might be found in space. So this is my favorite quote from Becky Chambers' science fiction novel, talking about instead of terraforming, instead of changing the environment of space to match our needs, our survival needs, perhaps we actually alter ourselves. So she says, this is her character speaking, I believe somaforming is the most ethical option when it comes to setting foot off Earth. I am an observer, not a conqueror. I have no interest in changing other worlds to suit me. I choose the lighter touch, changing myself to suit them. And this is related to another project that I was working on for Konrad Zosik, human enhancements for space missions. And ethically, the question is, do we owe space travelers protection from the harsh environment of space? I've got the 5 hazards of human spaceflight on the screen. Do we think that the extreme risk of being exposed to space radiation and gravity fields that are not what we're used to, do these justify, or in fact, do they demand enhancement technologies be used to increase survival advantage? If we decide that we should be allowing that, should that be mandatory? Should it be optional? How can we make sure that people are actually freely choosing these potential enhancements as opposed to feeling pressured to use them, either by their employer or just by their circumstances? So moving into my first case study. So I've got 2 major case studies here. The first one is planetary defense. So again, this is a project, this was a global project that was done back in 2019, looking at how we could collaborate together in order to protect Earth from asteroids or comets that might hit us. So I've got some artist impressions here. Of course, this is an artist visualization of a hypothetical laser technology that could shoot down an asteroid that might hit us. And then we have UCSB's Deep Space Project, which actually has a theoretical model where little iron rods with nuclear detonators would be spread out over an asteroid in order to break it up, pulverize it, and little pieces of it would burn up in the atmosphere. So that is currently being put through simulations. So these are just some ideas that people have come up with regarding how we could defend Earth if there was a planetary threat, such as an asteroid. But the ethical issues that I'm interested in, asteroids and comets are part of the space environment and possibly deserve some moral consideration themselves. And if you're thinking, but of course we're going to shoot down an asteroid if it's going to hit us, we might think, but are there any asteroids or comets that we think perhaps shouldn't be targets? So some people are already running the numbers regarding whether they could shoot down Halley's Comet. That is a comet that has significant cultural value to us as a species. People wait to see it. It's something that's part of our story. Planetary defense technologies are often dual use and could be used as offensive weapons. And when we talk about the ones with nuclear detonators, obviously there's a significant political issue with having nuclear devices in space, even if they're just intended for planetary defense. Planetary defense activities may contribute substantially to orbital debris, which may in turn affect other people's space assets. So you might damage someone's satellite, you would be liable for that damage. There is the risk that one nation state may act unilaterally to protect their own population if there's an impact hazard at the expense of other populations or other sacrifice zones. And that might be on Earth, or it could also be in space. And theoretically, we could end up destroying the potential for life in space if we destroy an asteroid that would have in the future been a site for the development of that life. So when I was coming up with ethical arguments for planetary defense methods, I thought the doctrine of double effect from medicine was actually quite helpful. So if we adapt the rules of the doctrine of double effect for planetary defense, what we're looking at is the criteria, the act itself, which in this case would be saving humanity, must be ethically defensible, independent of its consequences. So you may not think that humanity deserves to be saved. You might think if an asteroid's coming to hit us that we deserve it, and therefore we would not actually try to deflect that asteroid. But assuming we think it is at least allowable, then we move to the next criterion. The intended outcome of our planetary defense strategy must be good, and the negative side effects that we foresee can be things that we know are likely to happen, but they're simply not what we're intending. So in the case of the nuclear detonations, of course, there is a risk that that would undermine some of our nuclear non-proliferation sort of agenda on Earth. So if we're thinking that non-proliferation is something that's really valuable to us, and using nuclear weapons for planetary defense would actually seriously undermine that, we might still be able to justify it if we can prove that the negative side effect is merely foreseen but not intended. But then if we get to the next criterion, the bad outcome must not be the method of achieving the good outcome, that's when it falls over a little bit with the nuclear devices, because very much part of the method in those explosions is the nuclear device. And if we're saying that that's not desirable ethically, then it's perhaps not going to be allowable in this method. Then we have 4, the benefit of the good outcome must outweigh the harm of the bad outcome. So in a deflection sort of strategy, if you have to deflect from a highly populated area to a lower populated area, you would have to say the good outcome is outweighing the harmful sort of bad outcome. And you might be able to justify that on the numbers, depending on what your ethical framework is. So the assumptions, as I said, first, we have to assume that saving humanity is an ethical pursuit. If it's not morally obligatory, it must at least be morally permissible. And the second assumption is that there are methods of planetary defense that are ethically acceptable in isolation and in a cost-benefit analysis. So if you've got a piece of technology that is already banned for whatever reason, that means it's not going to be ethically acceptable in isolation. The technology has already been banned for whatever reason, and we're not going to be able to justify using it for planetary defense. In a cost-benefit analysis, of course, if we find that we're going to have significant destruction of space assets, then you may not be able to justify your activity there. So looking very quickly at some of the methods for planetary defense, it's not really the focus, but just giving an idea of how we'd run through one of these ethical frameworks. If we look at those nuclear explosive devices, we know that we could use them to destroy asteroids and comets that are discovered very late. We don't need to land on the target, and we do understand this technology very well. So we could use it for things that are discovered quite late. The cons, of course, you need to be very precise. It's currently illegal to detonate nuclear explosives in space. We know that they are banned as a weapon of mass destruction. There are risks of fragments landing on us if we actually detonate and parts of the asteroid break away and still potentially could hit us. And there's a very, very, very low risk that there could be some nuclear fallout there. But as I mentioned before, one of our major cons is that it might destigmatize the collection of nuclear weapons. And that's something that we've been working on globally for some time, making it such that people do not feel like proliferating their nuclear supply is something that is acceptable. If we look at kinetic impactors, so essentially this is when you send up a vessel to actually bump the asteroid off its trajectory so it doesn't come back and hit us. It is very straightforward. We have proof of concept. The DART mission has actually shown us that we can do this. However, we do need to know the mass of the target, or at least have some method of identifying how we're going to hit it. We need to know exactly where to hit it. There are still risks of fragments coming back to us, and there's also the risk of redirecting the target into a keyhole, which means obviously the next time it comes around, it's going to hit us. So in the first instance with the nuclear weapons, it is likely the doctrine of double effect is not going to permit us to use that. Doesn't mean other frameworks wouldn't allow it, but the doctrine of double effect is essentially going to say the dual use concerns are too problematic to use that tech. So the tech itself is the problem. Whereas for something like kinetic impactors, you're probably meeting the requirements of that ethical framework, but whether or not you're allowed to do it would depend on a detailed cost-benefit analysis. Are you actually going to make some other situation worse? You've got to factor that in. Gravity tractors have been mostly abandoned as a planetary defense strategy because very, very difficult to achieve this one. But you don't need to know the target compositional shape, and you can trim your orbits very precisely to avoid the keyhole issue. But the cons are huge ships are required for this, and you need very long notice periods before predicted impact, far more so than the kinetic impactors. So it's very likely that the doctrine of double effect will say, yes, you can use this technology ethically, but the reality is practically the technology is not there, and it's not likely to be successful according to the current science available. Then there's the hypothetical moon laser that would actually be able to respond to short notice threats and would not necessarily need a nuclear power source. So that's the major benefit there. However, it would require a very significant power source. And some people say you would need to despin your asteroid to make sure you could hit it at the right angle. And depending on the position, the laser could theoretically be weaponized if it could point back to us. Now, obviously, that's very hypothetical. We don't have anything that would currently be able to do anything like this. But in theory, the doctrine of double effect would allow you to use this technology as long as you could guarantee that it would not be misused in terrestrial warfare. So that's just an example of how we might tease out some of the issues with that particular dilemma. So there's another artist visualization of this theoretical laser technology that would actually be also used for mining, was how it was conceived. So the other case study that I wanted to cover is the concept of asteroid mining. So if we're not shooting down our asteroids, maybe we're mining our asteroids. So this was a project I was asked to do for space accounting. So I've never done work in accounting before, so this was quite interesting. So the ethical issues when we think about mining on Earth include that there's significant environmental damage that can be attributed to mining, significant health implications for workers and communities who live around mines, particularly open cut mines. But what we actually find even more problematic is when all these risks are undertaken by workers, by families, communities, they are not the people who are benefiting from the concentration of extreme wealth that mining actually allows. That wealth is held in the hands of very few people, and these are not the people who are undergoing the risks to actually obtain these resources. And many of these individuals are engaging in significant tax avoidance and therefore violating our social contract. So the idea that everyone should be paying into the system that they are benefiting from. So if you want to live in a community and have its protection, have access to education, healthcare, other resources, you should be paying your taxes as sort of the reciprocity in that system. That social contract should be that everyone is paying into the system, everyone benefits from the system in a way that is fair. But what we actually find is public money subsidizes private profit in mining, And more public money is then used to clean up the environmental and health damage that's being done. So the people who are getting very wealthy are not taking on the risk, but then they're not even taking on the liability at the end to fix the problems that they've caused. We also find the issue of lobbyists who control policy, leading to what we call regulatory capture. So regulatory capture is defined here as industry actors having preferential access to government decision-making and regulatory authorities, and governance decisions being based not on the public interest, but rather on those industry priorities. So this is something that we see in mining. We find that a lot of taxation law, a lot of environmental protection law is overridden in order to preferentially treat mining as an industry in a way that doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of the amount of damage that it's doing and in terms of where the wealth is actually accumulating. So it's not accumulating among the public. So in terms of the subsidies that a lot of people, particularly if they're involved in fuel trade, these subsidies have been listed here, Benjamin Cervical, as being equivalent to what would be needed to eliminate worldwide hunger and malnutrition 100 times over. So he's saying at the moment, and of course this is back in 2017, so it's only gotten worse since then, the world's potential $1.9 trillion in energy subsidies. So this is, again, contributing to mass concentration of wealth away from the public, even though the public are the ones who are suffering from the health concerns, environmental concerns of this mining. So if we can't do this right on Earth, what hope do we have for space? The good news is we are not currently mining in space, and we can draw up ethical legal systems that are better than what we have on Earth. So we can try and avoid regulatory capture. We can try and avoid the environmental and health damage, both in the mining activities and in the future use of the resources. So some people argue it's better to mine on the moon than mine on Earth. But if resources are being returned, of course, we need to be concerned with how they're being used. The reality is, if we're mining in space, that is probably to have the resources in space. It's not really feasible economically to have a return sort of industry there, but it might be in the future. And then we'd be looking at, okay, where are we actually burning this fuel, for example? We need to think about how to avoid the creation of asteroid mining magnets and how we can avoid people avoiding their taxes if they have an asteroid as an asset. Then we need to consider how we would resolve potential conflicts regarding commercial use of space assets or celestial bodies with things like the non-appropriation clause of the Outer Space Treaty. So we know that a nation state can't claim a celestial body, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't mine it, and it doesn't necessarily mean that a company can't mine it. And finally, for the astrobiologists, of course, we're very concerned with how we would protect other biosignatures. So what if there is potential life on this asteroid and we're changing how that asteroid exists? So Tony Milligan says there's every reason to believe that at some point in the not too distant future, decades rather than centuries, serious attempts will be made to mine asteroids. And you'll notice that's from 2015. We're already a decade after that. The interest has not waned, however. There are companies that are fighting for licenses to be able to mine in space and to mine asteroids in particular. So there are some ethical benefits potentially for this. So Daniel Pilchman notes that asteroid mining is poised to deliver massive benefits to humankind in the form of cheaper fuels and valuable materials without forcing humans to bear the costs of environmental degradation that have hitherto been part and parcel with resource extraction. So on its face, at least, he says, asteroid mining will be good for people. It might cause less environmental damage on Earth, and it might supply available sort of resources to off-world communities that otherwise would not be sustainable. So it could increase the quality of life of human beings living in space. But we might also be concerned about the harm to the space environment, harm to the space workers, and potentially harm to other life. So some insights from the Outer Space Treaty. We have According to the OST, countries are not allowed to claim sovereignty over any space body. If, for instance, a country plants a flag on an asteroid or a planet, it could not declare it as its property. There is something missing in the OST, however, since it does not specify anything regarding mineral resources that could be found in celestial bodies. And I'm quoting from Del Real et al. There. So one way that we could avoid the mining magnates, the tax avoidance, and all these other issues is to make sure that we just share all the spoils. And this is a very cute article from Forbes about the Psyche mission looking for the quadrillion-dollar asteroid and whether or not we should just share all the benefits. Now, of course, one problem there is that would crash our economy. So if we look at ethics of asteroid mining, we would want to focus on minimizing environmental damage on Earth and off-world as an ethical obligation, protecting the health and safety of miners, the working condition of these miners, preventing subsidies and regulatory capture from the outset. Now is the time that we can do that. Making sure wealth generated actually benefits the many and not just the elite. Also potentially making sure we don't flood Earth markets with space resources, because those economies might collapse. Whether or not you agree with some of those economies is one matter, but if we suddenly crashed a number of our economies at once, that would lead to significant pain and suffering on Earth. So you don't have to agree with the portfolios that people hold necessarily to agree that a sudden disruption of world economies could be a bad thing. We need to potentially prioritize space resources for space-dwelling communities. We might say if you're involved in the mining, you should actually get first pick of the resources to increase your own quality of life and that of your family or your community. And there must be ways that we can develop a system so that people don't just use space as the new tax haven. So if we go back to our key point of moral habitability, considering these case studies that I've brought up, I'd like to posit the following. Exploring space should not make us abandon ideals of equality and fairness, including in who gets to go to space. Working in space should not leave us vulnerable to exploitation and OH&S violations. Living in space should not cost us our bodily autonomy or human rights, or force us to take advantage of or destroy other life forms. Obligations to defend Earth from impact hazards from space should not undermine international space security or other peaceful movements, for example, anti-nuclear weapons movements. And mining in space should not compromise our values in terms of preserving the space environment, protecting worker safety, and possibly preserving property rights or norms, depending on how you feel about those issues. So that takes me straight to the 45 minutes. Perfect. So thank you very much for your attention. And I would love anyone, if they've got questions or discussion points, they don't have to necessarily be for me. They can be for anyone on the call. It would be great to have any of those questions.
When you talk to this, was it primary school students, and you talked about, was it artists and religious leaders, did you ask about philosophers?
Yes. So we asked about basically any field, what do they think was essential to have? And of course, they started with what you would expect, doctors, engineers, etc. But then when we tease them a bit further, they're like, well, obviously we need teachers. And I'm like, okay, so who's going to be the teacher? Like, what kind of teacher do you want? And then initially they wanted to capture as many human languages as possible. But then they decided that they couldn't afford that, because what if people don't speak the same languages? What if they don't overlap with any languages? And you've only got 100 people for your colony. They have to be able to work together. So in the end, they actually abandoned the idea of having any linguistic diversity in their cohort, which I thought was rather tragic, because there's so many concepts that are only really truly captured in one language and can't necessarily be translated into another language. So when it comes to philosophers, I think for the most part, the students kind of lumped them in with the religious leaders. So they thought, it was partly sort of like spiritual fulfillment to be able to philosophize. They sort of conceived of in a similar way as being able to learn about theology. And again, they abandoned that as well. So they eventually decided that people had to have exactly the same beliefs. So at most, they were going to let there be one religion. So presumably, they would also just have one philosophy if they were allowing any at all, because they thought that humans wouldn't get along sufficiently if we allowed them to have different views. It was a very depressing seminar.
Yes, it's very sad to hear that we were lumped together with religious leaders. What
Yeah.
about like historians and political scientists?
Yeah, so they did mention historians because they thought, it's important that we carry on our traditions as human beings. And that's also why they initially wanted artists as well, because they thought that was very important. But then again, they started saying, well, we can have an artist as long as the artist is also an engineer, because we don't have enough space to have any sort of like luxuries. And the fact that they would conceive of art as a luxury rather than an essential sort of human activity, I thought was very interesting. It made me rather sad, of course, but I found it very interesting. They were very focused on survival. So who's going to build the facilities to, keep us safe in space? Mm.
How about like politicians and journalists and others who are important for the democracy?
Yeah, they banned politicians entirely. They were quite strict on that. They were like, no politicians. Well, actually, no, specifically, they said no career politicians, which I thought was an interesting sort of addendum there. So they said no career politicians. And one of them, I remember saying, we will only let there be a leader if it's a leader that doesn't want to be a leader. If anyone wants to be a leader, that's a bad characteristic, and we're not going to let them in our Noah's Ark, which I thought was quite interesting. They thought if you want to, essentially, if you want to be in power, you're unfit to be in power, and therefore we won't allow you in.
I'm just curious about one thing related to moral habitability as a concept, and especially like to the fact that I guess like to some extent like what we consider morality is something that is the result of socialization or enculturation of us as humans, and to that extent, also environments in which we live shape our morals. So I wonder, like, to what extent have you considered that the moral part of moral habitability in space is something that is open to reinterpretation, because there may be a moral system that is inconsistent with the terrestrial moral system, just as a function of the environment in which human societies evolve offward.
Yeah, absolutely. And the socialization part is obviously very important, because even when we're talking about moral habitability on Earth, and when we're looking at things like, nurses feeling like they can't behave in alignment with their beliefs, their value system, when we interrogate that, it's often the case that what's happening is they feel like they can't be as caring and compassionate as they want to be, because they're burned out, because they don't have time, because they don't have resources, because waiting lists are what they are. There's too many people, there's too much need. But when we look at the higher order ethical obligations in an emergency room scenario, those higher order obligations are to things like effective triage and fair treatment. So you might say, yes, the individual might feel really conflicted that they can't give all the attention to everyone in that way. But as a society, we've actually decided, at least, well, most societies on Earth have some version of triage for this situation. We've decided that that's a better system than just being as caring and compassionate to everyone as you possibly can while the most urgent cases die in the waiting room. So very much a result of socialization. If you think about the kinds of things that human beings are happy to wait in line for, they're very, very few. And yet we have hospitals basically in every country every day where people are told they have to wait for the greater good. And usually, if we tell human beings you have to wait for the greater good, they don't. They riot, they steal, they behave very badly. But we've got this one area where we have so thoroughly socialized people that the higher obligation is to the greater good and the best survival, that people do. They just sit there for hours while they're in pain and they don't fight. It's very rare for there to be an incident in an emergency room where someone is actually being disruptive. And if we're thinking about space as potentially an extreme environment where we could engage the same kinds of socialization, yeah, we will end up with different moral systems there. But that will take time. And I guess with the Noah's Ark scenario, we're looking at these are people who have been socialized in this environment and how we're transplanting that into space. So maybe we only select people with particular characteristics that we think are more likely to adapt to a new moral system or a new social system in space. I'm not sure, but it's definitely very interesting.
Related to this, you're talking about the OST, the Outer Space Treaty, and of course that's from the 1960s. It's a Cold War construction. It's mostly concerned with, Cold War issues, militarization, and that kind of stuff, and not with space mining, and not with, private actors and so on. And some people argue that it's time to update, maybe renegotiate the Outer Space Treaty, while others say that it would be really dangerous to do that in today's political situation because there's risk it would all just fall apart. So I'm just curious, what's your take on that?
Yeah, we do have other documents, other agreements like the Moon Agreement and the Artemis Accords, things that are trying to look at particularly things like lunar mining and separate out whether we consider mining to be an appropriation or whether it's just use. And if it's just use, is that communal use? Does that still mean we're looking at the province of humankind, where perhaps you don't have ownership, but you have a right of use while you're in space to use what you need to survive? So those are the arguments sort of coming through there, whether, say, an asteroid might be considered res communist. So everyone can use it, but they can't own it. And of course, the sort of the flip side of that is you end up with that tragedy of the commons where it doesn't belong to anyone, everyone can use it, so everybody misuses it and no one takes responsibility for it. So that's obviously the bad side of it. In terms of whether we should update the OST, I am of the camp that says that's very dangerous. This is a document that has outstanding levels of agreement across the earth. There are so many signatories to that document. It's an incredibly successful aspirational document. But because it's very successful, it's aspirational. It's not action guiding in this particular instance. So as you say, they had never even conceived of the idea of something like asteroid mining when the OST was drafted. So it just isn't relevant for that discussion. But things like, exploration of space will be for the benefit of all. That's still relevant because if you're engaging in mining and becoming incredibly wealthy, there is an argument that that wealth belongs to everyone on Earth, because if we say space is the province of all humankind, surely the profits that can be generated in that area could potentially be interpreted as being a common good. So, yeah, I would not recommend trying to change the OST just because so many people have agreed and we really don't want people to be abandoning it. Obviously, we have had people abandon the Moon Agreement partly because it had that very explicit sort of ban on some mining activities that certain groups actually do want to engage. So I think I would leave the OST, but absolutely build up additional international agreements to cover things like mining, space tourism, OH&S in space industries, etc.
I think it's a very important topic, and of course I can agree with being issues that is concerned with such space mining and other issues. But at the same time, I personally feel a problem about how to deliver such a philosophical and moral voices and perspectives to international regimes and national policies. So do you have any idea or strategy? How do you deliver your perspectives to your country and to the international? I want your advice.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a really valid issue, of course. But I find that space actually allows us to argue things that we otherwise don't manage to agree on Earth. So people say, "Oh, how on earth can we do this in space when we can't manage it here?" But I think space actually provides the level of abstraction required that we don't get bogged down in nation state politics to the same degree that we do in terrestrial conflicts and disagreements, etc. So things like who will own resources for mines, who should pay for the repair of environmental damage, these are things we don't agree on here. And we've had a very long time to sort those details out, and we haven't. Countries absolutely disagree about whose responsibility things like climate mitigation is. So again, this is something that we can't agree on here, even though we are in the emergency right now. But I think when we put something in the space environment, because it does have that romantic appeal to so many people, like everyone looks up at the stars, everyone has some feeling about the moon, it actually does stimulate conversation that otherwise can be really difficult to start. So I think that things like, space mining actually might provide the template for better space regulation, mining regulation on Earth, that we use that sort of space environment as an analogy for what we're doing here. Protecting life in space is something that most people are really very concerned about, even though, as I said, we're leading to the extinction of species every day and people aren't necessarily paying all that much attention. Obviously, some people are, but plenty of people are not losing any sleep over the fact that we have countless species that humans have driven to extinction, and we continue to do so. But if you say, I found a bacterium on an asteroid, a very large number of people would be very focused on the survival of that life form. And I think that actually does provide us access to a certain, well, again, like the OST, it's aspirational. It's something that brings us together. It does have that power, that sort of draw, but using that effectively is the challenge. So how do we use something like, planetary defense to improve our international space security? I think there is an opportunity to do it, but we have to find ways that are enforceable, sort of regulatory systems that are respected, trust that is built across cultural barriers. So it's a real challenge, but I think it is possible. And I think it's actually easier to do in space than perhaps it is on Earth.
Okay. Yes, in this respect, do you think the concept of cosmopolitanism is useful to consider the topics about such issues in space? Do you think so?
Yeah, well, my colleague Nicholas Schmidt definitely thinks so. So he was the one running the Planetary Defense Project. So very much of the focus that nation states are part of the problem. And if we had a more cosmopolitan society globally, that we would be able to face existential threats in a more collaborative way that would be more effective. And I think planetary defense is a really useful test case for that, because in most cases, if we're under threat, it's not that one country is under threat. This is going to be a transboundary issue. We will always have large potential casualties here. So we've got that issue where it can bring people together, but it could also drive countries apart. They could end up sacrificing each other, just looking after their own citizens. And that would be the worst case scenario, because that's bad for everyone. So I think there's definitely a need for better collaboration across different stakeholders, whether that be a concept of a nation state or not. There will be different stakeholders in different areas. Potentially different corporations might be stakeholders in this as well in the future. So we could end up with private companies actually developing and testing the planetary defense technology, and then they have to have a seat at the table when it comes to how we're going to implement this strategy. At present, of course, we've got same page in the IAWN, great planning, but no country wants to take responsibility for actually being the party that decides what we do in an impact hazard scenario. So theoretically, there are some countries with the capability to deflect asteroids, but they don't want the responsibility of having to do it. So I think that's an interesting one too.
Okay, thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Would you not say people who are concerned about the microbes in space are the same that are concerned about microbes on Earth?
Well, yes, sometimes, but I usually do this experiment with my students. I ask them if I found something in space, like a bacteria or something like that, should I protect it? And they're always really quite obsessed over protecting that bacterium. But then I ask them about common bacteria that cause massive human suffering and disease. And they're like, no, we need to eradicate that. We need to eradicate that immediately. And it's a bad example because, of course, COVID is a virus. But if I say, what should we do with COVID-19? They're like, get rid of it, absolutely destroy it, obliterate it if you can. So the same people that are very concerned about something in space being protected just because it has life or the potential for life are perfectly happy to sacrifice things that we know are alive. So, microorganisms that are causing disease in humans. They're very happy to prioritize the human survival over those microorganisms in most cases. There are, of course, exceptions, but I find that people are much more interested in preserving very small life in space than perhaps they are on Earth.
I mean, if I can, I don't want
to
hold on to. If no one objects, I have a more like philosophically nerdy question.
Ooh.
You mentioned the doctrine of the double effect, and I was thinking, why would you use that? If I may explain myself, I mean, it is a very contested idea for different theoretical reasons, but there are also some practical issues. If you think of environmental ethics, for instance, as it turns out, very few problems are caused on purpose. I mean, we have this. I think of this distinction between foreseen and intended consequences. Not many of the bad consequences are intended, but they are foreseen. Which means that this distinction between foreseen and intended consequences is maybe not that useful and maybe even harmful if it is used as like an excuse, saying that, well, I didn't intend for this to happen, but everyone understood that it would.
Yeah, and that is the very common objection to the doctrine of double effect, of course. And one of the things that comes up a lot there is people often look at the doctrine and say this is about justifying foreseen harm because of, known benefit or predicted benefit. But they often forget the criterion that demands that the bad outcome cannot be part of the methodology of achieving the good outcome. So the reason I chose doctrine of double effect for planetary defense is because almost all of those planetary defense technologies are inherently dual use, which means they absolutely do have foreseen potentially negative consequences, even if you don't intend those consequences, because they have that capability sort of inherent in the nature of the technology, sort of looking at, okay, how do I separate out the very pure utilitarian standpoint is just going to say, okay, if the asteroid's going to hit 1 million people, then you just deflect it so it hits 500,000 people and there's no further discussion. The utilitarian's just on the numbers. So you deflect just according to the numbers. And it doesn't matter how you deflect because, of course, the method is irrelevant. It's just the outcome in that particular framework. Whereas some of the other frameworks like virtue ethics, of course, you can apply that, but again, it's not going to be particularly action guiding when it comes to what technology should you use. The technology is not demonstrating virtue, so it's just the person who's using it. So with double effect, of course, you can look at, okay, separating out foreseen and unintended from intended. The best example I can use is from medicine because that's sort of my background in the health sciences. And that's when you think about something like vaccinating a child. when you choose to vaccinate a child, you're doing it to protect them from potential future illness that might be severe and might be, potentially fatal for that particular child. But in vaccinating a child, you are deliberately inflicting a small amount of pain through a needle to a child who often doesn't understand what's happening. So you are, in that moment, technically torturing a child. You're stabbing them with a needle. That is an unpleasant thing to do. They don't necessarily consent to it. They are upset by it. They will potentially have, a small fever afterwards, that kind of thing. So if we're thinking about, is it justified? Well, yes, because you're protecting that child from potential death. So yes, on the numbers, you can say, yeah, the cost-benefit analysis is clearly in favour. But the way that we can separate out double effect there is, if you had one doctor who gives the vaccine just because they want to save the kid, and you have another doctor that gives the vaccine because they love torturing children, they love stabbing them with needles, that's the best part for them, and the outcome is the same. So in utilitarianism, they're both doing the right thing because they're saving the child and any other child that might get that infectious disease. But intuitively, we feel like that first doctor is doing something very different to the second doctor, even though in literal terms, they are actually doing exactly the same thing. They are stabbing a child to protect them. But one of them is doing it with entirely different motives. And you can see the difference would come out, because that's more of a virtue perspective. But the difference for double effect is, if we suddenly had a new piece of technology that could vaccinate the child without stabbing them with a needle, doctrine of double effect no longer lets you use that needle because it's saying, okay, this is no longer a foreseen but unintended side effect. You are now methodologically choosing the negative side effect bearing technology, the needle, because you enjoy stabbing children. And then it becomes unacceptable because the methodological step involved has the negative outcome, which is the pain and suffering to the child. And if you can remove the bad sort of outcome from the method, you have to do it in the doctrine of double effect. So it's not just that you have to justify the bad or that you have to say, I didn't intend the bad. If the opportunity to remove the negative outcome from your method is available to you, it can't be part of the method. You can't say, I did not intend to do this intrinsic part of what I was doing. And we can tease that out, because as soon as there's an alternative to doing that thing, if you choose not to do it, then you're like, well, you cannot possibly say you didn't intend to stab children to hurt them, because now you've got an option not to, and you're not choosing it. So clearly that was an intrinsic part of your method. Therefore, it was never ethical, despite the fact the outcome was the same. So in terms of technology for planetary defense, something like the nuclear explosive, you can say, well, I'm really sorry that that might undermine political efforts, but that's not my intention. That is just a foreseen but unintended side effect. But as soon as there's a non-nuclear power source that could do exactly the same thing, if you then still don't choose to do it, then it becomes part of the method that you've chosen. That is unacceptable, because in and of itself, it is part of the bad outcome being in the method, not just sort of attached to it in that foreseeable but unintended way. It has now become your intention because you're choosing to have it as one of your steps.